Rachel Carson. Rachel Louise Carson, born on May 27, 1907, died on April 14, 1964, was an American marine biologist, writer, and conservationist whose influential book Silent Spring, 1962, and other writings are credited with advancing the global environmental movement. Carson began her career as an aquatic biologist in the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and became a full-time nature writer in the 1950s. Her widely praised 1951 bestseller The Sea Around Us won her a U.S. National Book Award recognition as a gifted writer and financial security. Her next book, The Edge of the Sea, and the reissued version of her first book, Under the Sea Wind, were also bestsellers. This sea trilogy explores the whole of ocean life from the shores to the depths. Late in the 1950s, Carson turned her attention to conservation, especially some problems she believed were caused by synthetic pesticides. The result was the book Silent Spring, 1962, which brought environmental concerns to an unprecedented share of the American people. Although Silent Spring was met with fierce opposition by chemical companies, it spurred a reversal in national pesticide policy, which led to a nationwide ban on DDT and other pesticides. It also inspired a grassroots environmental movement that led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Carson was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Jimmy Carter. She wrote 24 books, and her most popular book was Silent Spring. Carson died at age 56 after a long battle against breast cancer. The Edge of the Sea and transition to conservation work. Early in 1953, Carson began library and field research on the ecology and organisms of the Atlantic shore. In 1955, she completed the third volume of her sea trilogy, The Edge of the Sea, which focuses on life in coastal ecosystems, particularly along the eastern seaboard. It appeared in The New Yorker in 2 condensed installments shortly before its October 26 book release by Houghton Mifflin, again a new publisher. By this time, Carson's reputation for clear and poetical prose was well established. The Edge of the Sea received highly favorable reviews, if not quite as enthusiastic as for The Sea Around Us. Through 1955 and 1956, Carson worked on several projects, including the script for an omnibus episode, Something About the Sky, and wrote articles for popular magazines. Her plan for the next book was to address evolution. However, the publication of Julian Huxley's Evolution in Action, and her own difficulty in finding a clear and compelling approach to the topic, led her to abandon the project. Instead, her interests were turning to conservation. She considered an environment-themed book project tentatively titled Remembrance of the Earth, and became involved with the Nature Conservancy and other conservation groups. She also made plans to buy and preserve from development an area in Maine she and Freeman called the Lost Woods. In early 1957, a family tragedy struck for the third time, when one of her nieces she had cared for since the 1940s died at the age of 31, leaving her 5-year-old son, Roger Christie, an orphan. Carson took on the responsibility for Roger when she adopted him, along with caring for her aging mother. Carson moved to Silver Spring, Maryland to care for Roger, and spent much of 1957 putting together a new living situation and studying specific environmental threats. By late 1957, Carson was closely following federal proposals for widespread pesticide spraying. The United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, planned to eradicate fire ants. Other spraying programs involving chlorinated hydrocarbons and organophosphates were on the rise. For the rest of her life, Carson's main professional focus would be the dangers of pesticide overuse. Death. Weakened from breast cancer and her treatment regimen, Carson became ill with a respiratory virus in January 1964. Her condition worsened, and in February doctors found that she had severe anemia from her radiation treatments. And in March they discovered that the cancer had reached her liver. She died of a heart attack on April 14, 1964, in her home in Silver Spring, Maryland. Her body was cremated and Carson's ashes were divided for burial beside her mother at Park Lawn Memorial Gardens, Rockville, Maryland, and the rest scattered along the coast of Southport Island, near Sheepscott Bay, Maine. Collected papers and posthumous publications. Carson bequeathed her manuscripts and papers to Yale University to take advantage of the new state-of-the-art preservation facilities of the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Her longtime agent and literary executor Marie Roddle spent nearly 2 years organizing and cataloging Carson's papers and correspondence, distributing all the letters to their senders so that only what each correspondent approved would be submitted to the archive. In 1965, Roddle arranged for the publication of an essay Carson had intended to expand into a book, The Sense of Wonder. The essay, which was combined with photographs by Charles Pratt and others, exhorts parents to help their children experience the lasting pleasures of contact with the natural world. Available to anyone who will place himself under the influence of earth, sea, and sky and their amazing life. In addition to the letters in Always Rachel, in 1998, a volume of Carson's previously unpublished work was published as Lost Woods, The Discovered Writing of Rachel Carson, edited by Linda Lear. All of Carson's books remain in print. Grassroots Environmentalism and the EPA. Carson's work had a powerful impact on the environmental movement. Silent Spring, in particular, was a rallying point for the fledgling social movement in the 1960s. According to environmental engineer and Carson scholar H. Patricia Hines, Silent Spring altered the balance of power in the world. No one since would be able to sell pollution as the necessary underside of progress so easily or uncritically. Carson's work, and the activism it inspired, are at least partly responsible for the deep ecology movement and the overall strength of the grassroots environmental movement since the 1960s. It was also influential on the rise of ecofeminism and on many feminist scientists. While there remains no evidence that Carson was openly a women's rights activist, her work and its subsequent criticisms have left an iconic legacy for the ecofeminist movement. Attacks on Carson's credibility included criticism of her credentials, in which she was labeled an amateur. It was said that her writing was too emotional. Ecofeminist scholars argue that not only was the dissenting rhetoric gendered to paint Carson as hysterical, but was done because her arguments challenged the capitalist production of large agribusiness corporations. Others, such as Yoko of Garb, suggest that in addition to not being a women's rights activist, Carson also had no anti-capitalist agenda, and that such attacks were unwarranted. Additionally, the way photos of Carson were used to portray her are often questioned because of few representations of her engaging in work typical of a scientist, but instead of her leisure activities. Carson's most direct legacy in the environmental movement was the campaign to ban DDT in the United States, and related efforts to ban or limit its use throughout the world. Though environmental concerns about DDT had been considered by government agencies as early as Carson's testimony before the President's Science Advisory Committee, the 1967 formation of the Environmental Defense Fund was the first significant milestone in the campaign against DDT. The organization brought lawsuits against the government to establish a citizen's right to a clean environment, and the arguments employed against DDT largely mirrored Carson's. By 1972, the Environmental Defense Fund and other activist groups had succeeded in securing a phase-out of DDT use in the United States, except in emergency cases. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, by the Nixon administration in 1970 addressed another concern that Carson had brought to light. Until then, the same agency, the USDA, was responsible both for regulating pesticides and promoting the concerns of the agriculture industry. Carson saw this as a conflict of interest since the agency was not responsible for effects on wildlife or other environmental concerns beyond farm policy. 15 years after its creation, one journalist described the EPA as the extended shadow of Silent Spring. Much of the agency's early work, such as enforcing the 1972 Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, was directly related to Carson's work. In the 1980s, the policies of the Reagan administration emphasized economic growth, rolling back many of the environmental policies adopted in response to Carson and her work. Thanks for watching HerStory channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe our channel.